Welcome to a new segment of Jewish Wisdom on JTV. We're joined again by Rabbi Dr Akiva Tatz. Thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Pleasure.
Let's talk about your new book, As Dawn Ends the Night. You can get it in most Jewish stores, I presume. What would you say is the basic premise of your book?
Basic premise of the book is that Jewish history fits into two phases. The first phase we call the phase of revelation, or Gilui, when there was prophecy and miracles. And then between the men of the Great Assembly, during their era, which stretched from Purim till Hanukkah, which is going back about 2,300 years, the lights went out. The prophetic level dropped to a post-prophetic, post-biblical era, which introduced what we call the phase of the oral law. So the basic premise of the book is understanding that transition, what happened in human culture, what happened in the human psyche, the human spirit, because understanding that transition correctly is a major key to many, many subjects in Judaism.
What would you say to someone...
Can I show you?
Sure.
For your viewers.
Get a little reading.
In the back of this book is a graphic chart.
I never saw that.
Okay. So my son prepared a beautiful graphic. I'm sure your readers can see that. That is an overview of Jewish history.
That's
so
brilliant.
It takes you through from the creation all the way through, and it shows in the middle of the chart, Ollie, if you care to hold the book that way, then we can show your viewers. So the chart takes you through Jewish history, and this band here is the so-called men of the Great Assembly. Mm-hmm. So until then, you had a prophetic era with the books of the Bible being written, and here you have the phase of the oral law, the Mishnah and so forth, where there's no open revelation at all. Mm-hmm. So that's the graphic display of that categorical. And on this side, for your viewers, we have documented the great personalities who lived in each era.
Fantastic.
But the main thesis here is that human society and human culture and human intellect and spirit changed drastically at that time.
What would you say to someone that says, okay, so you're saying there are two phases to Jewish history, the sort of stage of open prophecy and miracles, and then the closed stage. You could say, an atheist would come to you and say, well, that's a very convenient argument to make, to say that, well, previous generations had miracles, but we don't.
Yes, indeed. You are right. Not only that, the Talmud itself says that one who wishes to sell a lie puts his facts at a great distance, long, long time ago in a far-off place. Mm-hmm. Indeed, it's true. However, although it's convenient, from an atheist perspective, it just happens to be true as well. In fact, my book begins with a statement by a famous astronomer from the last generation who said that the reason I do not believe in God is because I see God everywhere in the Bible and nowhere in the world. Mm. Meaning that, the two should match exactly. Our axiom is that the Torah is a perfect description of the world. I see the Torah mentions God on every line. That is supposed to be a perfect mapping to reality. I see the universe, I see God nowhere, and therefore one must be false. I trust my experience, the Bible must be false. What he didn't know, this great astronomer, is that the Bible maps to the world only when the Bible applies, namely when the Bible is being written and speaking. After the Great Assembly, the Bible falls silent. We move now into the phase of the oral law, which is derivative, and no longer is the Bible actively speaking to us in terms of being dictated and being manifest in the world.
But isn't it said that Abraham looked at the world and saw within it the Torah?
Indeed. So there's no question that you could fathom reality correctly if you were clear enough and great enough and living close to the dawn of history like he did. But there's no question it was easier for him in one way, in that the voltage of his time of history was much higher. We are now approaching the bottom of the feet of the human form. So for us to fathom it with that level of clarity and prophetic insight, that would be impossible.
So it's not just that you have a stage of open spirituality and miracles and then closed, but it's that it's always on the decline.
Yes, so this is what we call Yeridas Hadorot, the decline of the generations, which is in fact a stepwise decline. So you have a set of generations for 500 years, a plateau. Then there's a great luminary who ends that phase, and we step down again. But of all these step-down stages, by far the greatest was the massive step from before prophecy, when there was prophecy around, prophecy, miracles, revelation, God speaking openly in the world, to the post-prophetic darkness that we inhabit now. Mm-hmm. Or as the Kabbalists would say, from the body to the legs.
Right. So where are we at right now in Jewish history?
Our generation is called Ikvas de Mashiach, which means the footsteps of the Mashiach, the messianic form. But the Kabbalists, as always, translated literally. We don't only mean the footfalls that you can hear of the messianic form, we mean the bottom of the feet. So we now inhabit in the cosmic human form the thick, dead, insensitive skin on the bottom of the feet. In fact, the Talmud says that when man was cursed originally in his battle with the serpent, you shall bruise his head, he will bite your heel. The poison is injected into the heel, even in Greek mythology. You echo of this, right? The heel is the vulnerable, the spiritually vulnerable part. The Talmud says that after death, the heels do not rot because death inheres in the heels even when you're alive. One of the great authorities of the Mishnah was allowed into the cave where Adam is buried, the Machpelah, and after sin and after death, he saw that the light shining from Adam's heels was greater than the sun, meaning the part that's dead even in life. So the heel is always the completely devolved, insensitive part of the body.
So we're the generation of the Walking Dead.
And that's, you put it very well. It's
Very inspiring.
fascinating to know that the bottom of the feet are a medical mystery.
Really?
The thick dead skin on the bottom of the feet has no nerves at all. When I was a teenager in South Africa, we used to walk barefoot in the summer. I had a close friend who used to put his cigarettes out on the bottom of his own bare feet. Thick, callous skin, insensitive. But the most sensitive part of the body to being tickled. Very interesting. So Rav Moshe Shapiro, one of our great teachers, put it this way. He said, our generation is exactly like the bottom of the feet. Totally insensitive to the worst brutality and immorality, but available for superficial stimulation that makes empty laughter. That's our culture. So we indeed are the bottom of the human form with the tail end, the pre-messianic generation. That's agreed. How long exactly this will last, we don't know. And so we are representing a tremendous devolution and insensitivity in human history.
If this is the case, that the generations decline over time in terms of their spiritual capabilities, isn't that how are we meant to feel? Isn't that meant to make us? Won't that make us just feel a bit rotten? And how can we really achieve anything of any spiritual significance?
Right, great question. So there are two important things to know. First of all, although we are devolving and declining and degrading, we are superior in one way. We see further. The reason we see further is because we stand on the shoulders of giants. So although we may be dwarfs or midgets, but we see further than they did because we build on what they... And the analogy, there are many analogies. One is many generations who dig a well fruitlessly. And finally, after all the work has been done, one fortunate fellow comes along and he strikes water, right? So that he could never have done that without the work. But he reaps the benefit. The common analogy is standing on the shoulders of giants, which Newton famously said, if I've seen further, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants. In fact, I could recommend to your viewers a fascinating book. The name of the book is called Otzog. Otzog. A moment's thought will show you. Otzog is On the Shoulders of Giants, by Robert K. Merton, who happened to be Jewish, a professor in the United States, Harvard professor. And he wrote a book documenting the history of the aphorism on the shoulders of giants. And it turns out that in the 13th and 14th centuries, there were classic Jewish rabbinic figures who used that analogy in their writings. Newton picked it up later. And it's a fascinating academic discourse on that phrase. But we find it in Kabbalistic sources and Torah sources, and the concept is that although we are small, we can reach the moon, which they couldn't do. We can achieve technological feats that they couldn't do. We can have spiritual insights that they couldn't, only because of the barriers they broke, that we can now pass through. And secondly, your viewers might find it inspiring that you are correct. When we are such a low generation, we can achieve very little. And your take on that is, but shouldn't that be depressing? And the answer is this. The answer is that we see Jewish history as a continuum. Let's take, for example, prayer. Thinking about it negatively, I would say the great prophets prayed for the Mashiach, the Messiah. They were not granted. Rabbi Akiva, the great sage, right? He was so powerful that when he took his shoes off to begin praying, they used to pray without their shoes, it began raining. He asked for the Mashiach, no God.
So what hope do we have?
What hope do we have? But here's the answer. It's very important to know this. There's a barrel of prayer and Jewish tears that needs to be filled over history. The great prophets half filled it by themselves. People like Rabbi Akiva, gallons. And as history progresses, each of us is putting less and less, but the barrel's getting fuller and fuller. And at the end of history, some broken-hearted, pathetic Jew will utter one last, almost hopeless prayer, and that will fill the barrel. And therefore, as things get worse, there's more reason for hope. You can put in less, but less is needed. And we have the privilege of being close to the phase in history. One final effort will actually yield a result. Strike water.
Does the concept of the decline of the generations mean that we are morally weaker people? I understand we have less spiritual capacity or insight, but are we morally weaker?
No, we are morally exactly equivalent, and this is because we have a doctrine known as the point of free will. Morality means the struggle against the lower self. When you talk about morality, we see that as the battle between the higher self and the lower self. We talk about free will being applied in the area of morality primarily. And that battle is always equal. So no matter how high or low you are on the scale, you're always battling your own dark side. And that's always in proportion to the good side. And so whether you are a lowly individual with tremendous disadvantages or a highly privileged individual with tremendous background advantages, it makes no difference. It makes an objective difference to the world, but not to your judgment, because you are battling your own lower self. And if you live in a generation of history where the lights are very bright, so then you're operating at a level of great voltage. The danger is when the voltage is greater, you can achieve more, but there's more danger. When you're working with some little cables of electricity, you might be able to power a few appliances. If you touch them, not pleasant, but you may survive. But if you're working with the high tension lines, with 11,000 volts running through them, you can power a city, but if you touch one of those, you're fried. And therefore, if you lived at a phase of Jewish history where the voltage was intense, great spiritual things could be achieved, prophetic insight. But of course, if you put a foot wrong, disastrous. So the balance is always maintained. I would say that if you play tennis, tennis is meaningful only against someone on your level. If you play somebody way weaker than you, there's no victory. If you're a good club player and you walk out onto the court, you find you're being challenged by a 3-year-old. The kid walks out there with his diaper and you win, but it's insignificant. On the other hand, if you play the world champion and you never see the ball once, I wouldn't say you lost, I would say you didn't play. Tennis is meaningful only against an opponent more or less on your level. And the axiom of Jewish spirituality and free will and the axiom of Jewish history is that we always pitched in battle against warriors as mighty as we are. And so as your free will level grows, your lower self grows as well. And you never outgrow the battle. So the answer to your question is we are not less moral or weaker morally than previous generations. We are pitched in a battle against a moral challenge proportional to our greatness, and that never changes.
Yes. Someone said to me recently, they said, where is the source for the concept of the decline of the generations? But I was actually grateful to read in your book that you actually provide a series of sources. Would you mind just elaborating them a little bit just for our viewers?
Yes, there are many. The Talmud says if the previous generation, if they were like men, then the next generation were like donkeys and we're like ants. So, or another statement in the Talmud is that the fingernail of the previous generation was greater than the belly of the latter, right? Or if they were like gold, we like dust. There are many, many rabbinic statements in the Talmud that indicates an objective decline over the generations, notwithstanding the fact that we may see more and have insights that we can have because of what they did. That's not to be denied.
Does it mean we have the ability to overturn what prior generations decreed?
That's a wonderful question as well. If your question is meant technically, the general principle is that a later generation cannot overturn a ruling of a previous generation.
Yeah.
In other words, because of the decline, we don't have the competence to do that. The technical language in the Talmud and the codes is that in order to overturn a ruling of a previous generation, you need a Sanhedrin, a convocation of sages greater in number and wisdom than the previous. And axiomatically, that's almost impossible because we are getting less. Not totally impossible, but that's the general concept. And therefore, the general idea is, with many, many reservations and exceptions, we're not able to overturn previous rulings if they fit into this. Here's an insight you might find interesting. There's an axiom that in Talmudic logic, an authority may not argue with anyone in a previous stage. In other words, you can argue, let's say we are now called Achronim, the last 500 years. It's legitimate to argue with anyone in your phase. You're in the same league, to use a football term. You cannot play people in a different league. It's just illegitimate. You just never get to. Sometimes, paradoxically, we have a later generation beautifully resolving a question that was unanswered by a previous one. How does that happen? Let's say you go back 800 years and you have a fantastic question of the Tosfos, right? The great commentaries on the Talmud. They remain with an unresolved question. Tzorech Iyun, we don't know. 50 years ago, you have a great Torah sage who writes a beautiful resolution to that question. How's that possible? The principle you begin with is, if they did not give that answer, almost certainly it's wrong. This latter day great, he gives the best answer that he can in terms of his wisdom at his level. And they almost always begin with the words, if not for the fact that Tosfos didn't say this, I would have suggested. In others. Here's a beautiful analogy. How is it that a person less competent could succeed, where a person more competent fails? I once heard this from Rabbi Shurkin, wonderful teacher, Rosh Kollel in Azata. He said this, imagine two men imprisoned in a room. One can see and one is blind. They're imprisoned. The sighted man sits on a chair. The blind man starts feeling the walls. And eventually comes to a crack in the wall, and he feels he can slip out. And he slips out and escapes. You have a paradox. The blind man has escaped. The sighted man, he remains trapped. But the solution is this. The blind man feels the gap in the wall and he takes it. He takes his escape. The person who can see sees through the gap. He sees it's a heck of a lot worse out there than it is in here. So the person, and therefore the greater generation declined to give that answer because they saw far enough to see that if you give that answer, the 13 problems you encounter down the line. So we're always using this principle that the later generations, in an absolute sense, are lower.
Right.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.